This podcast, Strange, Rare, and Peculiar, is for kind of those in the know about homeopathy, deepening your knowledge, bringing you more information about what you need to know and maybe what you can leave aside about homeopathy.
Homeo what?
Homeo what?
All right, here we go. We're underway. Good morning, good evening.
Hello, hello.
How you doing?
Good. Podcast number 4. Here we go.
Number 4. Why did we miss a week?
Oh, because it was just too busy.
Oh, my Lord.
Because things get busy when you're a homeopath in 2022 trying to change the world. And when you have, and when you have to move your kids from one apartment to another in Brooklyn. I mean, there is that too.
There was that one, yes.
Anyway, but here we are. And today's topic is about something that we are intimately involved with, and that's homeopathy education. And in particular, clinical training and what it's looked like historically, sort of how we got through the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and what it looks like now in contemporary times, which I think is super important since homeopaths are in high demand these days.
It's true.
Wow.
But I'd go even broader because I'd say that...
Go broad. Don't hold back.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I reckon that homeopathy has so much to teach other complementary medicines, even though they might not buy into that. From what I've seen over the years, the way in which homeopathy is able to, because of its predilections and peculiarities, navigate online learning, navigate tough times. There are a couple of tips and tricks and secrets that I think are good for naturopathy, that are good for massage therapy, that are good for yoga therapy, that are good for all sorts of stuff.
Can we just talk about yoga therapy for a second?
I did my first yoga session today.
Since we've moved into our house, which is almost 5 years ago.
And I was pretty impressed because, I've got these guns now, so I could actually hold a plank.
Yeah, you got some serious guns, mister.
But man, geez, that was really tough.
You made a lot of noises. Some of them quite unexpected. Actually,
some of them
they weren't unexpected at all, to be honest. But
make it stop.
It was really nice though to see you, join me in my sunrise routine. And what was your response when you were done? That was great. I'm going to need to be in bed by 2:00 this afternoon. Anyway, all right. So, but I think what you're saying is that the peculiarities of homeopathy, I think this is one of the things that I love when I talk about what we do, is that we, as this 230-year-old modality with its roots in ancient medicine, take really well to technological advances.
It's true.
Weird. It's weird, though, right?
It's weird and true.
Yeah. I mean, but we, and something I've been thinking a lot about is, I was about to say something that before working on the research for my thesis and really studying what homeopathy looked like and what homeopathy education and training looked like, during the time of Herring and Lippy, so during the latter part of the 19th century. I can't.
I know where you are.
You know where I am. I think you're right about the coffee being backwards, the decaf and the calf.
You reckon?
No, I was making that up.
170 years ago, anyway.
170 years ago, I would have said, things are easy for us because we're a hands-off modality.
Yeah. So a talking modality and an ingestive modality.
But which was great for us during the pandemic, and which is great for being able to provide services all around the world.
For sure.
From your home office. But it's interesting to look at homeopathy education back 170 years ago, which was for all intents and purposes the same as medical education, and was often done in a clinical setting, in, as you would say, a laboratory. That there, when there were, there were homeopathic hospitals or hospitals of homeopathy, and that's very different than talking about a hands-off modality.
Yeah.
Right? So I think it's an interesting conversation because I think we're a blend of both, and I'm a bit of a fan of having both.
Nice. Why don't we go there? Why don't we talk about education, the practice and education in 1840, 1850? First school set up in 1835, but it didn't really last that long.
Allentown Academy here in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, the the funder pulled his funding and it went under. They couldn't survive on course fees alone.
Well, they were also teaching in German, which, given that they were mostly Germanic of origin, and that was the seat of medical knowledge at that time, before it really moved to bedside practices in the Paris School of Medicine later.
Right.
So, I mean, so that would have been sort of the a mark of an elite education would be teaching in the native language of sort of the highest level of medical education at that time.
And then 1848, the next school emerged. Mm-hmm. And I always get the names wrong because they change.
I was hoping you were going to say, because I know, I do as well.
Okay, so the words Philadelphia and Pennsylvania,
yeah,
and medical and college and Hahnemann
are all in there.
Are in the two schools.
So it's the is it Homeopathic College of Pennsilvania, Homeopathic Medical College,
and then there's the Hahnemann something of Philadelphia.
Yeah, Hahnemann Medical College, Philadelphia. I need my notes. And it's tough, right? Because in my thesis, I'm writing all about that, and I literally have sticky notes so that I get it right and with the dates, because I cannot retain that.
Right. So
no, I'm admitting that publicly.
Somebody tell us.
Yes.
The next school was in 1848.
Yeah.
And but it's not so much about dates, but I'm fascinated by what you said. The Parisian School of Medicine. What's that?
Well, so the idea, the Paris School of Medicine was that at a time when, so medicine, if you think about historically, medicine was not practiced in an institutionalized setting. Medicine was practiced in someone's home. You know, you didn't roll up to the, acute care clinic, the 24-hour flashing light medical service.
There was no ER.
There was no, or A&E, or A&I, accidents and injuries, right?
We say A&E.
A&E, accidents and emergencies. Yeah. And also, just as an aside, and one of the, I know it's slightly tangential, but one of my favorite parts of studying the history of medicine, which is something that we talked about that you loved, was the history of the ambulance.
Oh my God, there were no ambulances until essentially 1970
in the
something.
70s.
Yeah.
That's just crazy. And they were refurbished hearses.
I mean, what a great dual income.
Right.
You take people in your...
Take them live,
in your hearse.
take them dead. Whatever, Right. Turn the air on if you need to, keep them warm when they're alive, cool when they're dead. Anyway, but so what happened though was the setting for medicine started to change as medicine moved from, being providers going to someone's home, or providers being a medicine woman, traditional healers. Medical doctors had very little training. Right, and if you needed a procedure, that was done by a barber surgeon, or in later days just a surgeon who wasn't a doctor. They were like a technician, right? And so all this starts to come together, though, and the Paris School of Medicine is when that's talked about. It's when medicine moves into a hospital setting, and medicine takes place at the bedside in an institution. And this is the beginning of of medical testing, of standards of care, of all these sort of attempts to measure what's in and out of the body, inputs, outputs, measurements. It's the first time this happens, and so it was kind of interesting that. So this is all happening, and across the ocean in America, different places in America were adapting to these new technologies at different rates. And Philadelphia, what I'm finding really compelling about my research is that Philadelphia was, even though it was probably, well, it was one of three hubs in medical education and sort of and hospital systems at, if we're talking in the later part of the 19th century. But it was a little slow on the uptake of some of the biomedical, tests and inputs and things. And so, but what was interesting was the argument was happening at the same time in the medical societies of Pennsylvania. It was happening in the exact same way in the homeopathy world.
What discussion?
Well, we're going to save that. That's my talk at the JAHC conference. Right. But a little insight into that is just how much, and if we talk about it through the standpoint of homeopathy, how much of the new knowledge do we take on? I mean, Hahnemann, although he had an understanding, sort of from 30,000 feet understanding of like germ theory, you know, the morbific agents that were transmissible from one person to another. I mean, you read, you know, I forget what year it was written, but his treatise on epidemics, which is basically like a regurgitation of Hippocrates on epidemics. And he says, look, if the person across the street from you has an infectious disease, don't go in their house. Stay far away, you know. And then he talked about just like little bit at a time, breathing in that bad air, little bit, and so forth. So he definitely had understanding about infectious properties, right?
So you're saying that knowledge, the growing knowledge, was affecting both homeopathy and conventional.
100%.
Right.
And surprisingly, at exactly the same time, same arguments were happening. Because like, how do you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube.
That's one of your favorite
I
expressions.
love that expression. As someone who blurts things out.
Yes.
I've had to apply that to myself.
We say you can't put the cork back in the champagne bottle.
And why would you?
In sport, often, especially in those last-minute losses.
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, I now know from being married to a Kiwi.
Let's not talk about it.
Never.
But let's talk about the clinical training part of this, because that's fascinating context. So clinical training is kind of, you know, out of the classroom and where the rubber hits the road, right?
Yeah, totally.
And so,
you think about it, it's like how you do your job. It's your actual application of principles.
Right. So it's kind of separate from, you know, this is a femur and this is an eye. This is now how we go about the curing, the fixing, and the application of our art and science.
Yeah.
So I was going to go really sideways, but anyway, it's a guess. My guess is that early homeopathy clinical training was apprenticeship model and was, excuse me, Dr. Hahnemann, my name's Stapf. Can I come and sit in your office, please?
They were such good buds.
Yeah. What do you think? Am I kind of correct with that?
I would say yes, but no, because, think about Herring and Hahnemann never even met.
Well, they talked a lot over the highways and the byways. Lots of letters.
They sent letters. I don't know how many. There were certainly a few, but I think that there was, people studied the philosophy in the very beginning very deeply and then just worked on applying it. And, if you think
do you mean in their own offices without clinical training?
I'm going to say yes.
Okay.
And was Benninghausen the first non-medical doctor to practice homeopathy?
No, probably not. I think there was this guy Ziv that he was a priest who took homeopathy to Russia.
Really?
Yeah, it started with Z. I can't remember the name. Might have been Ziv.
I've never heard of him. I need to find out.
Yeah, and some of the in other places the Jesuits were part of the movement of homeopathy early to, is it Chile or Brazil? I'm a little loose on that. But anyway, no, there were some non-medical applications of homeopathy in the very early days, 1820s, 1830s.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But fast forward to 1833, Herring arrives in Philadelphia or in Pennsylvania, and the first school, the Allentown Academy, as we mentioned, teaching in German, but they were all medical doctors. It was postgraduate education.
Well, and also all men.
And all men.
And so that must have been fun.
But so clinical training. I'm going to say there wasn't such a thing as. If we think about the model of sort of how medicine was delivered at those times. There were European hospitals by then. Hahnemann, in Vienna, right, when he was making his way before he went to Transylvania, but it was I don't know that homeopathy was in the very beginning practiced in that way. Hahnemann had taken himself out a bit, don't you think? Yeah.
Do you think because I'm going, so when did clinical training actually begin? I'm thinking, is it Kent's postgraduate course?
No, because
1890s, no?
No, it would have been...
Before then? Much before then?
Sure.
Okay.
Because it would have happened in the two schools for which the names we cannot get right.
Right, the two schools. One became the other one in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I'll get the names. I have it right sitting behind me. But,
well, what do we know about it then?
Well, it was hospital-based.
Okay.
It was clinical. It was clinically based, but it was also apprentice-based.
And the rounds.
And the making rounds.
Okay.
Making house calls. that book that, what's his name, Calvin Nur, Herring's grandson, wrote, The Life of Herring.
Sorry,
I was wrong.
Husband of his wife.
husband of his wife.
Husband of Herring's daughter. Oh my Lord.
That's it, his
You
son-in-law.
said grandson.
Oh, sorry, son-in-law.
Yeah. I'm going,
But
I
we are
can't
pathetic.
find, after my head injury recently.
So
Hang in there,
Herring's
folks.
son-in-law, Calvin Nurr, and he wrote this great book called The Life of Herring, and so many stories about house calls or about people, sending a letter. As I've been reading all of these letters between, Herring and Lippy and Nurr, and just going through all of their, the family papers and so forth, and you see how, who's running these letters. They had, I guess, their servants or their groomsmen or whomever who would just take these, these letters back and forth, because sometimes there are 3 or 4 of them in a day.
Yeah.
I've just received your letter. I've sat down. Thank you for sending this. My man has just delivered it to me, and it is with immediacy that I am responding about Mrs. So-and-so and her bladder stone. It's like, and then they run it back, and that's how it, that's how it happened. Kind of like our acute clinic, right?
Well, exactly.
That was before Slack.
Yeah. That notification was Slack, by the way.
Which is the way it's done today. Instead of sending your fine gentleman to 3 blocks away to deliver the message and to wait for the kindly reply. So I think that's kind of what happened. And then you kind of fast forward, and there, it happens in educational institutions, I think, as opposed to in medical institutions. I mean, if you think about Hahnemann Hospital, right? So there would have been, up until whatever between the 20s and the 40s, I think there was still homeopathy being taught. From the 40s to the 60s. It was an elective, and after that, it existed not at all. And I mean, there's so many ways to look at this, because homeopathy also shifts in the medical setting to become less and less and less and less about Hahnemann's overarching philosophy and application of principles into an eclectic therapeutic model. And I don't mean eclectic medicine, but at that time, if we're talking about the latter part of the 19th century, there was no holds barred. So you had people giving low potencies, high potencies, material doses, giving, nostrums or, patent drugs along with their homeopathic remedies, prescribing therapeutically. So it was quite different. Right? And then it branches out, and then it becomes this new wave of homeopathy, which after homeopathy really did a little crash and burn, kind of 1880-ish, which everybody blames it on the Flexner Report. Homeopathy lost its way because it ceased to be practiced according to its principles. It was practiced just as giving potentized substances for therapeutic indications.
Yeah.
True. That's as good as you can, as you make it, as you're lucky. And so homeopathy, as it's meant to be, kind of disappeared. And when it started to come back, that's when I think things changed. I mean, that's where, I think if we're going to talk about clinical education, right, I think talking about it in a more contemporary sense is probably important.
Yeah, before we do that, just want to go back, because I realised when I said Kent 1890, that is actually relevant, because what we think of Kent's postgraduate course and the lectures on Materia Medica were transcripts of Kent's lectures. It was actually a teaching clinic.
Talk about the numbers. Those numbers are phenomenal.
Yeah, well, 40,000, this is a number I remember, 40,000 clients were seen over 10 years.
But how many graduates were there of that program? It was like 30-something, right?
35 graduates.
So it's really interesting, because those numbers, how do we...
It's 4,000. Maybe I just got the number wrong.
Uh-oh.
No.
All of a sudden, this podcast is going to need a full-time fact checker.
Yeah, it might have been 4,000 clients a year. Well, that's 40 over 10 years. No,
okay.
That's it.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so 4,000 clients a year.
That's so interesting. That's our number. Our goal is 5,000 clients a year over 5 years to have a 25,000 case.
Well, and when you think about it, I mean, that's a truckload of clients per day.
Yeah.
Yeah, to do the math. Anywho, let's fast forward then, because, I mean, maybe more contemporary times. My introduction into the teaching of homeopathy involved the classroom for a while, and then I did get into clinical training in a number of different places. And the model, and I mean, what I wanted to speak about a little bit were some of the models that I saw. Would that be?
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember one of the impressive ones. I was doing a lecture a couple of lectures in Canada at Toronto, and went to CCNM, Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine, and at the time it was in the motel in the north. That's the way I kind of remember it. It was I think it was actually some sort of an old motel with very long corridors, and off the corridors with the clinic rooms.
Yeah.
And with this excellent host and lovely gentleman, I put on my white coat and then went from room to room and opened the door in the middle of the consultation and said hi, and then listened for a little bit, everything okay, and then we moved on to the next room, to the next room, to the next room.
I don't like that model.
Yeah, really interesting. See, I'm not a fan either. But the thing
that was the model I was trained in.
Good, okay. And so that training model has advantages and disadvantages, and limitations, and probably some good things. But at the end of the day, the supervisor is relying on an excellent synopsis of what actually went on in that clinical setting. And obviously, one of the limitations is not a lot. Well, I mean, perhaps no consultation ever was seen in full.
Right.
In using that model.
Well, can I tell you what? That's when I took over a teaching clinic. Running a teaching clinic back in 2010 or 11, something like that, and that was the model that was used, and there were all these cases going on at the same time, and then students who had never been monitored taking an entire case would come back with a recommendation, and I was like, based on what? I mean, it just never seemed like enough information.
Yeah, exactly.
So
we've both had the same experience from the same model. Another model at a college. And
hang on, can I say one thing? How that could work really well is if you're doing very medically oriented homeopathy, because you've got sort of checklists of did you get this information? And one of the clinics where I used to teach or supervise, they had the students would go into the consultation room with a checklist.
Well, but that comes from medical homeopathy in the 50s and 60s.
Exactly.
Elizabeth, is it Hubbard Wright or Wright Hubbard?
Wright Hubbard.
Wright Hubbard. Her checklists and questioning style was just that.
That was the standard.
And that's where it came.
Yeah.
That's where it came from. My own, one of the schools I supervised clinic in Sydney in Australia was you'd turn up on it was usually Saturday, and it was a real struggle.
Yeah.
10 o'clock or 9 o'clock till, 5. And you'd sit there with the students that had signed into the clinic that day, and you'd wait.
For a client to turn up.
I've
been there.
And there was a lot of waiting.
Yeah.
And a lot of going through the files going, let's put this one in front of that file, or, And eventually what happened is that the students would be taking the cases of the students.
Ugh, that is so ethically... I can't even... I've seen that happen, and I find that really difficult.
Really troublesome.
Especially because I think this is sort of a good entry point to say, for some people they might not have any idea of what happens in a homeopathy school teaching clinic. And, if you're working with what has now been termed classical homeopathy, which is sort of a dirty word, I sort of like just homeopathy or Hahnemann's homeopathy, because there really are offshoots, and you kind of need to say what it is. But the way that it's evolved, especially if you're working in a community that understands Hahnemann's theory of chronic disease, and sort of the idea of the simple language and getting to the deepest part of the case, also because that's sort of one side of it, and that can very easily turn into some psychological,
totally.
extravaganza. The other side of it is what's actually happening in the body, and what are all the ways that the totality of symptoms, in other words, the aggregate of everything that's happening within the person, how do we see that? And that involves a very careful investigation of both the mental, emotional, and physical symptoms. So you're kind of doing 2 or 3 things at the same time, right? And so that means that a case, especially if you're in a teaching clinic, a case will take 2 hours, to really make sure that, that the students are seeing the full exploration of what,
Are you talking about case analysis or case taking?
Case taking.
Got it.
Because if you think about it, you really can take a chronic case in under an hour.
Totally.
I mean, I've done it a gazillion times working in, you know, an outreach clinic, right? And it's I like how Jeremy Sher calls it no BS homeopathy, which is what, you know, he and Camilla have sort of set up in the, you know, in the work that's being done in Tanzania. And the idea is that you don't have to get into so much of the story. Now, I think when students are learning, and you've got to demonstrate best practices. What are all the moves that a homeopath can make? And so a case will take longer, even if it's a faculty member taking a case. I mean, I'll do the full show at 2 hours. Even you.
I went to 2.5 hours. I couldn't believe it. And I was riveted. I don't even know. It was a really interesting client.
Yeah.
I kind of was happy to keep talking.
Yeah. But you're not just having a conversation. I mean, it's a really guided exploration, right? Yeah. All right. So if you've got that amount of time, there are all these things that you have that, you know, that the students have to see. And so if they're not being observed, that's a lot of time to go in the wrong direction.
Now that is exactly what happened in my own personal experience at clinical training when I was a student, because clinical training was outsourced, right?
For real? I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so we had to go find our own clients.
Yeah. And
then we would take their case. And then we would take the case notes to a supervisor.
But they didn't watch you?
No. Not at all. And so the only face-to-face component of that experience was sitting down with the supervisor. It was like the blind leading the blind.
It's totally, because and this is, if you know, for someone who might be just listening, you know, to this and saying, wait a second, what is this? You know, what are you talking about? So, if you go to a homeopath, right, and a consultation takes, depending on the, you know, the sort of skill level and personal proclivities of the practitioner, anywhere from, you know, 1 to 2.5 hours. Now, there are people who take a 10-hour case, whatever. Well, that's an outlier. We'll just leave that. But, you know, in order to be efficient at your job and knowing you get all the information you need, you know, 1 to 2 hours, let's say.
Yeah.
So when students are taking cases, I mean, there are so many kind of nuanced moves that a practitioner makes to ensure that they're getting the information. Yeah. You've got to be observed, right? So like
and critiqued
and gently critiqued. You know,
well, critique doesn't mean criticize.
Yeah,
critique, you know, means hang on, you could have. There are different ways of doing that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think a teaching clinic needs to demonstrate best practices. You know, it can't just be watching a bunch of students take cases. It's got to be, you know, highly skilled, you know, clinicians who are demonstrating the ways in which the job is done. And so, in all fairness, because I think, you know, there are a lot of clinical training programs that, for whatever reason, aren't able to do that. And I think, you know, this is where we have to talk about sort of that fallow time in homeopathy education, where you were lucky to get clinical education, you know? I mean, that's fair. I mean, because if you think about it, before the technology, before there was, you know, really high quality, real time, you know, live video technology available, it meant you had to go to a place, right? And so, you know, you and I, we moved, you know, you moved country. You know, hemisphere, right?
Continent.
I moved to the Midwest, which for me was like, that's almost the same.
It's the same.
It was definitely a transition, but you had to like be somewhere in order to do it. And then because, you know, so you either had people who were lucky enough to live near a homeopathy school with a clinical training program, or people who had the flexibility in their life to move to that place, right? But that meant that school operated on the weekends, you know, once a month, which we won't even go into that now, how stressful that is. But, you know, we recognize, you and I, we've talked about this so much, that the way of getting good at homeopathy is to see it a lot and then to do it a lot.
Numbers. Repetition.
Right?
Practice.
The hours that you spend in that chair watching and talking about what's done in real time is so critical. And so there, you know, and I say this genuinely, in all fairness, there were it was impossible to deliver that much clinical training for many years because of the model, the limitation, right?
That's so interesting. So clinical training involves many things, but one is a period of observation.
Yeah.
Students, newbies, being told, you know, this is a bike, you know, look at all the things on the bike, the features of the bike. Before then, the integration and application of that. All right, now get on the bike and I'll hold the back seat, or we'll put on the trainer wheels.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that happens, though, is that gets done by video,
in
a lot of schools.
Right.
Right? Observation hours are like watching movies, which watching people's cases being taken is compelling.
Cherry-picked cases.
Cherry-picked cases. I mean, we know that there are a few in circulation of you with a full head of hair.
Hey.
So I'm just saying, you shaved your head on the millennium. Now, why is that important? Other than seeing you with that hair is a treat.
It's a mere 22 years ago.
22 years ago. But times have changed. Pathology has changed. The homeopath's job has changed because people are sicker.
Yeah.
We've got pathologies that didn't exist. You know, if you look back 22 years ago, the number of people who with neurodivergency were not coming to. We wouldn't even use that term.
No.
Autism. How many autistic clients? I mean, I didn't really see a lot of autistic clients in my practice until, I remember like 2006, 2007. There was a shift.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe a few before then, but that was like the big shift. But look now, what about pandas? Pans and pandas, right? So how, if you don't see cases, COVID, long COVID, post, people who have been grappling with lots of, medical interventions that may have impacted their health, well, that's what we see. If you're watching videos, it's good because you're seeing the process. But those conversations, I mean, how much time do you think we spend talking about what happens in the consult?
After the consult?
Yeah. It's easily hour to, it's
usually
2 to
4
1.
hours. I'd say 4 hours.
Yeah.
4 hours minimum.
So a 2-hour case gets 4 hours of discussion plus other work.
Analysis.
Discussion.
Yeah.
And if we do that with our students, they see about 100 cases.
So we do that live.
Yep.
And that it's not as if other models don't do that live, but I just remember that part of the process used to be compressed, and sometimes there's 3 students waiting in a line as the analysis and evaluation goes on.
Yeah.
And that's not not conducive.
I can't imagine. I mean, because it was funny, one of the, I've kind of run a few different, we both have run, a handful of clinical training programs, and they're each different, and every one of them has their own benefit.
Yeah.
But it's funny that you and I both landed on the same place of how we like to see it. Like, at first it was, different groups taking different cases and then presenting their analysis. That was kind of the typical model. Mm-hmm. And when I started teaching in a program where, first of all, I couldn't understand what the students were talking about, I said, well, I think we're going to do better if we all learn from the same case and deconstruct the cases together. And we've switched our model totally to that. Do you feel like we never really talk about this as like...
I think it's hugely beneficial.
Oh, good.
As long... Well, it is.
I probably should have asked that off air.
No, it's hugely beneficial because, firstly, it gives students the opportunity to see homeopathy through the lens where they're at. And so if they're a third week student or a third year student, they've just seen the same case.
Yeah.
And they're going to be asking questions from those perspectives. That's enormously useful, and you see exponential leaps in it's educationally very sound, I think.
It totally is.
Yeah.
How many people did you have in your clinic yesterday?
40 something.
Do you know how many I had in my clinic Monday and Tuesday?
Yeah. How did you get
82?
Why did you get 82 students?
I'm just saying. It was amazing. When I looked at the number, I was like, wow. Yeah. And it sounds like it's so many, but...
But hang on, here's a question.
Oh, sorry, yeah?
Because is it beneficial for all 80 students? And I wonder, because this is one thing I'd say, is because, there's different types of students, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know how you classify them, but, there are students, and it doesn't matter what model of education they're going to use. They're going to nail it.
Yeah.
Because they're committed, they get it, they're passionate, they're entrepreneurial, they're good managers, they're good clinicians, And then there's those folks, and I think that's where we've probably got it right. There are these people in the middle, and we attend to those folks.
Well, because the small group work,
Right.
That's the thing. So I think we should say that when there are 82 students, and we're broken into groups, and there are when you're working with the advanced students. So I had more than half. I think I had 50 some were advanced students, and they're we're guiding through the process, and then the newer students are working with another teacher, taking them through, okay, this is what you've seen, and really breaking it down to their level. And then we come back together at the end of the day, and the advanced students, kind of show their stuff that they've really mastered this.
Now, there's real benefit in that as well, actually, because, if you're a newbie student and you're looking at a complex chronic case,
Yeah.
now your
Oh my
job is
gosh.
not to analyze that chronic case, but to be able to project and go, oh, in 6 months' time or in a year's time, I can be doing that?
Yeah.
Okay,
It removes some of the anxiety,
I
doesn't
really
it?
think it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a real benefit, having those kind of multi-level classes.
And you know what else? This is another thing that I've noticed because, sometimes, and programs are developed in different ways. And I think, I always say you find the program that suits you. So, we're kind of talking about what has worked for us and for, for our student body. But so one of the things that I think about a lot is, we opted to have a program where students can come to clinic in their first week. They don't even know the terminology yet. But an analogy that I use a lot is that, homeopathy takes a certain degree of fitness and you have to be able to do a lot of things in the background. If we go back to where we started with the yoga analogy, I love this analogy so much because when you first start with yoga, it's like a stretching exercise. It's not even an asana at that point. And you're basically grunting your way through getting into a pose, right? And then the more adept you get, you're able to work with your breath. So the bodily motions become second nature, and then you can focus on your breath. And that's all in preparing you for being ready to do the meditative work and the breath work that takes you to a higher level of consciousness. So we take that idea and we put it in terms of homeopathy clinical training. One of the things that I talk a lot about with the students in the beginning is, you got to learn how to sit for 2 hours, and if your body isn't used to it, it's like a real thing, your butt goes numb, you get fidgety, you get squirrely, your monkey mind takes over. You start leaving, something that is a deep, something that touches you deeply from maybe your own personal pain or experience. You could leave your consciousness and go somewhere else to go to your happy place to not be thinking about it. So all of those skills you can do in the beginning where the high level learning is passive. But you're still hearing it. You're taking in the language. You're not going to be talking about what to do with developed sora in semester 1, but you've heard that developed sora exists, and you know that if that's happening, there's a certain clinical move you might not make, right? But all you're responsible for in the first couple of weeks is sitting on your butt for 2 hours. So that idea that you're developing the clinician first by developing the physicality and the skills, the note taking, being able to sit and focus, to look at the client while taking notes. When you are just in practice mode, you're able to develop those skills to try different things, And so, and then the other thing about it is if you get students into the clinic early enough on, they don't sort of act like they're stoned. I call it bong talk. Sorry, it's really terrible. But you get somebody with a couple of years.
I know what you're talking about,
right?
Yeah.
And if they haven't actually seen the job in action, the conversations in the classroom are bizarre because
they're very theoretical.
Totally theoretical.
And we see that in our program where those students have not done a lot of clinic and have got to advanced stages of their didactic training.
Yeah.
And I've never heard it called bong talk. I love it.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
Oh my gosh. You haven't been in my classroom enough. Yeah, it's bong talk. Because it's really theoretical and it's like, it's not useful. It's interesting, right? But, that's after dinner talk when you're with your friends at the conference. But
and it's speculative for sure.
And it can be speculative. So what and also what students do if they don't have the foundational skills for what the job of homeopathy really is, then they start to rely on, I shouldn't even say they as students, I think anyone would start to rely on whatever skills you already have. And because we're dealing with human nature in a physical as well as mental and emotional place, we go to, the speculation about why they are making their choices in their relationships and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting so that when they're in the clinical setting and it's like that's all well and good but their gallbladder's broken.
Yeah.
That's all well and good but we've got all of this simple language. What happens is when students are exposed over and over and over again to best practices and sort of pushed in to stay in that space without speculation, then they can get to higher levels of thinking, right? And you can still even in the very beginning, engage in that, even if you don't know how to use the repertory yet, or whatever, right?
When you talk about best practices,
Yeah.
I reckon there has been a shift in the last number of years because, do you remember Homeopathic Symposium?
Oh, yeah, of course.
All right. When I think about it, I remember the excitement about that in some homeopathic circles. Oh, I could do some clinical training hours with this expert.
Yeah.
And now when I think about it, I go, are you kidding me? A cherry-picked asynchronous case
Yeah.
with a model answer that is also analysed out of the expert. I'm not a fan of asynchronous learning anymore. I think it's got some advantages of flexibility and time, but not a lot of
define that for people who might not be familiar with that terminology.
like in the can, a lecture that's pre-recorded
and videotaped, or like if it's a clinic.
Yeah, a
thing,
video.
yeah.
It's a videotape thing, which then you can consume. The consumer can consume whenever they want, as opposed to it's live. It's 4:00. Everyone get here now.
Yeah.
And that leap of, and it's been really with, GoToMeeting and Zoom and and I don't know, Teams and whatever else the technology is that's enabled it. But it is exponentially better.
Oh my gosh. And I think because, while I'm just really happy that there were people who had the wherewithal to put those kinds of trainings together when that was the best thing that was available.
Totally.
Right?
And it'll probably change, in the
exactly.
next
Like
5 years.
I feel like we're in a sweet spot now, which is great. And, but now that you can be in the moment, the other thing about that, there are two things. One is that we don't always get it right. And the hardest move in homeopathy is second prescription.
Sure.
Second prescription being the one after the first prescription has acted. And homeopathy, once you get past the fallacy of the simillimum and finding somebody's soulmate in nature and that crazy talk, you realize that you're just working sick people. Sorry, every time I say it, you laugh. But you're working sick people back to health.
Yeah. And
that's a journey. It's not like homeopaths are some magicians that see deep into your soul, and I hate that. It really irritates me because it's
I
like
see deep into your soul.
Okay, well that's fair, but it feels like a charlatan thing to me. That's really terrible to say. But I feel like, when you really work with really sick people, like if you've got a kid with Crohn's disease sitting across the table from you, don't get into all this, let me just study the trees for 6 weeks because of this. He's got tree energy or some, I don't know. Sorry, it's so cynical, but it's not one. It's rarely one remedy.
Yeah. Almost never.
I mean, Hahnemann says in Aphorism 171, in order to unravel the deepest level of chronic disease, and he's talking then about antipsorics, but it's still, anybody who's been in practice and has moved the needle for a person with a complex, chronic issue knows that it takes time, it takes focus, and not like you're changing remedies every week or even every year sometimes, but you are focused on the movement of the case. And I think when students see that in real time and they see incremental movement towards greater levels of health, as opposed to jumping around, they get the confidence to not feel like, oh, I need to find that one answer. Because I think that's unattainable. And I think that model doesn't build confidence or competence. Do you think?
Well, I've never been a fan of it.
Yeah.
I don't believe it. I don't even know what to say about it. It's so far. It's always been so far from my working life.
Yeah.
And while interesting, no doubt that there's interesting theories and models, and I've always left a seminar or reading someone's opinion about, I don't know, thinking, well, what would a client of mine say to me to make me think that? What would a client say about their health to make me go, well, it's a such and such?
It's a zebra.
Yeah.
It's got to be a zebra.
Got it.
They would say, because it's just so black and white. No. Sorry, I was totally cynical there. I apologize for my cynicism. We've got to wrap up because we have a research meeting in a minute. Can I just add one more thing?
Damn.
So the other thing that I think about a lot with clinical training is, and I think you and I do this kind of differently, which I like, and Kelly probably does it. Kelly Callahan, who also teaches in our clinic. But one of the things that I've been into for the past couple of years, more than before, is I've realized that students, there's a little bit of, it's not analysis paralysis in how do I approach the case, but when you get into the weeds, there's sort of there's the mechanical part of homeopathy, right? So, translating symptoms to rubrics, for example, is always difficult. And when I started to think about, especially with working sort of one-on-one, and supervising students, what are the idiosyncratic ways that individuals make decisions, and what are the things that we can do that are really process oriented, so that you always know, if I'm stuck, I just do this, and at least it's going to get me to from point A to point B. And so I've been doing a lot of what? Oh, shush! Your favorite remedy. But so what I've been doing is working on mechanics a lot. It's kind of like teaching math, order of operations. And so if you can sort of let go of a lot of the speculative things that have seeped into our practice and say, okay, if I can really be clear in this analysis, then there are certain steps that I can take. And so I've been working a lot with teaching students how to use, right now we use Radar Opus, right? And so we're working with the Adonis new repertory. And it's like, okay, so why don't we just use it? Let's try to use it to its full advantage, which for someone who had to change software packages a few years ago is hilarious. Hilarious. But, working with the tools and really helping, to do that so that, and it's not like the tools give you the answer, there's no way, but you have to learn how to use them to find information. And so what we've been working on a lot is, I've been giving answers. So what I've been ending clinic with is, here are 10 different ways that you could repertorize this, or here are 5 different things, and these are the next 3 things that you can do to potentize your learning.
And all of that is live?
Yeah.
Yeah. How many clients do you think, like ideally, how many clients would the average student need to see to feel competent and competent along with excellent didactic learning by the time they've finished their schooling?
I mean, we've landed on 100.
Right.
And I think 100 is the threshold. Like when I hear, sorry, my cynical voice is going to happen again, but when I hear that people just watch 10 video cases and write them up and that counts for their, it makes me want to cry, because I look at our students who are amazing and who might have 75 cases under their belt and say, I'm struggling. And then of course our students get their one-on-one supervision. So they've got, it's not just in the big clinic classroom, but even with that, I mean, that just really speaks to it. And I think, especially if you're, I was going to say, especially if you're working with non-medical homeopaths, but there's a different learning curve that happens with medically trained folks, right? Because they've got to switch from their the more reductionistic way that they've learned to tackle problems. But, you're working with non-medical people, and if we really want to elevate our profession to this place where someone who has not been to medical school, who has, really solid foundational training in anatomy, physiology, and pathology and so forth, but you've got to talk about these cases. You've got, if you've got it, I think about all the kids in my practice that are dealing with really complex issues. The level of responsibility that I feel, well, I wouldn't want to send somebody out to do that and not be prepared. Yeah. Right. And so I hope that as we move forward as a profession and the demand is higher than ever, that we all take really seriously what it means to do this job. Yeah. Right.
Love it.
Wow.
Wow.
I get really passionate about
You're
this.
all worked up.
I'm all worked up. All right. I totally get worked up.
Time for a cup of tea and a Bex.
Yes. My goodness, no. It's time for a cup of tea and our research meeting.
All right, let's do that.
All right. Let's do it again. Should we do it again?
All right.
All right.
See you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Ciao.